Hello, everyone. This is James Wolf here from AVJ. I'm one of the coordinators of this Sustainable Change Champion webinar series. And we want to welcome you today to the webinar. I'm filling in for Tom Reed, who's the program manager for the Energy and Manufacturing in the Appalachian program. And today we have a great conversation about resilience that will be provided by Dr. John Camillus. His topic will be how to make your organization resilient to complex and wicked problems. Dr. John Camillus is the faculty director for the Center for Sustainable Business at the University of Pittsburgh. And we just want to mention to all of you that I'll be providing a link during the webinar to the Energy and Manufacturing Appalachian program. And we invite you to look at those resources. And Tom is excited to follow up with all of you with a video of the webinar after this presentation. And again, please feel free to utilize those resources for manufacturers in the Appalachian. So with that introduction, I know there's some more attendees that are joining as we speak. I want to turn it over to John. And John, welcome you to the floor, and we look forward to your presentation. John is an expert in organizational strategy, so it's going to be a great conversation, and we look forward to your feedback and comments. Take it away, John. Thank you.
Thank you, James, and good morning, everybody, and delighted to be here with you to talk about, as James said, resilience. And I think you've got to be a little cautious when somebody's identified as an expert, especially in this area. We're all novices to some extent. Of course, I've been in this area a very long time, but we see the evolution of the thinking in strategic management. And I'd like to share with you the latest thinking in terms of handling the kind of VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment that we are facing today. So talking about resilience, before I go to the next slide, I just wanted to say that when we look at resilience, which is a word that's used in almost every discipline, we talk about recovering from a disruption or from a downturn or an issue which has affected us negatively. But in this conversation, we're going to go beyond that and identify the opportunities in disruption. So when you talk about resilience here, we're talking about ending up stronger and more profitable than we were prior to the disruption. So with that introduction, I want to mention that this is the second in a series of webinars. The first one was offered by Dr. Marcel Minutolo, and that was on managing transformational change and how to become a change agent within your organization, again, to drive sustainability and resilience. The next webinar is listed here. It'll be offered on April 11th. And will be focused on the business case for energy audits and be offered by Bart Stewart and Desmond Green of WB Engineers. I've listened to this, and it's a fascinating hands-on kind of presentation, which I'm sure you'll find of great value. So continuing here, I think the reason why we are all here today is recognizing that the future, the world that we are operating in, is not at all similar to what we have been engaged in. And in fact, if I could use the term wicked, which I guess is popular now because of the movie, or the use of wicked in the Boston context, the way people use it. But it is a wicked world in many characteristics. And I'd like to talk about these characteristics and how they impact the notion of what we do strategically in an organization. And that's the next notion. What are the implications of the kind of characteristics of this wicked world? And then we leap upwards into the notion of how do we thrive in this difficult context, challenging context, and grasp the opportunities that emerge. And finally, give you some very pragmatic, down-to-earth notions about how to create an organization that not only tolerates such uncertainties and volatility and ambiguity, but actually thrives on it? What is the design of the organization, and what are the key result areas in terms of ensuring the organization has this capability? So, coming to the notion of the future, it's really important because essentially, when you talk about strategy, the definition I'm going to use is strategy as the construct that harmonizes the organization and the environment. So there's so many definitions of strategy, but this concept definition is what I'd like to focus on. And essentially, this it derives from the classic concept of corporate strategy developed by Kenneth Andrews in 1970. It's exactly the same notion, looking at the strengths and weaknesses of the organization, the opportunities and threats in the environment to arrive at the strategy of the organization. Now, in terms of developing strategy for today, we need to look at tomorrow. That's obvious. I like alliteration, so I shoved those words in the title. But essentially, it's an obvious thing. Without understanding the future, we cannot manage the organization today. And this is what I'd like to spend the next few minutes on. How is the future different from the future that we have experienced until today? There are mega forces out there, and I am going to focus on three. It's not a casual choice. The choice of these three has been honed over a period of time. Where I started, and when I started in this area doing consulting for organizations a few decades ago, we had a 35-cell matrix, but in terms of understanding the environment, these three, what we are labeling mega forces, highlight the characteristics that are important to us as we develop strategy in the context of tomorrow's environment, business environment. Not going to spend time on the next three slides because essentially it's a justification of the relevance and significance of these three forces. People debate globalization, but as I said, that ship has sailed. If you don't innovate, basically, if I could exaggerate the situation, but it's not too far to say, too excessive to say that if you don't innovate, you're dead. And an organization in stasis, there's not much difference between that and an organization that's dead. And then while there's a lot of debate about ESG, there is no option but to take into consideration factors that are labeled as ESG because the European Union demands it, Japan recently is requiring it. And actually, you can trace its roots back to 1950, where ESG considerations were identified by General Electric as one of the four of them. ESG-related characteristics were this part of the set of 8 key result areas necessary to be focused on for survival. So what I'd like to talk about today is that not only are these mega forces independent and discrete, they also interact. And these interactions are actually of even greater significance to the organization because we look at the interaction between globalization and innovation. There's not only the traditional sustaining innovation, or let me use this unfortunate word, localization, where one modifies one's products or services to meet the characteristics of the other territories or countries that one might be trying to get into. And basically, this results in disruptive technologies to address the price point pressures and the unique characteristics of the other countries and other territories, which leads to what is called reverse innovation. That's an unfortunate phrase that Prahalad and Govindarajan have popularized, and Jeffrey Immelt, when he's CEO of General Electric, embraced. But I've also heard my colleagues in engineering call it innovation blowback, which is perhaps an important notion. But essentially, disruptive technologies emerge, and that's the challenge and the opportunity that the interaction of these two forces create. So keeping this in mind, just leap to the fact that if you put these three forces together, the interactions are fascinating. When you innovate and change your business model, the multiple stakeholders that you recognize from it through an ESG lens tend to, how shall I say, some are advantaged, some are disadvantaged. So you get a conflicted set of stakeholders when one innovates. and you're recognizing a variety of them through an ESG lens. Now, you take these multiple stakeholders with different concerns and you put them in a context of great uncertainty, which is what's caused by globalization. I don't need to elaborate on that. You can't tell me what the world is going to be like next week these days sometimes. So, I mean, after April 2nd, it's going to be a different world. So, for example, so in that context, what you have with multiple stakeholders with different priorities and perhaps different values operating in a context of great complexity and uncertainty, that's a petri dish, that's a crucible, that is a cauldron that creates wicked problems. And you put together disruptive technologies, conflicted stakeholders, and wicked problems, and you have a perfect storm which businesses have to traverse, have to survive in order to manage in the world that is emerging. Okay, so let's take a closer look at this. When we talk about forces like globalization, innovation, and the pressures of ESG, we're looking at something where there is basically volatility, but one can hopefully predict the directions of each of these, at least in the near future. But then if you recognize what is also happening today, which has always been happening, but is happening with great rapidity and in multiple dimensions today, pandemics have changed the world we operate in. Climate change, that the US military has identified, actually for more than a decade, climate change as perhaps the greatest international security threat that's faced. And you might look at this differently, what the causes are, but the consequences of climate change are painfully obvious. If you look at the notion of gene editing and therapies, I mean, one of the recent issues of it, The Economist was talking about superhumans, and that's something that is not an impossibility. And therapies are changing lifespans. I mean, there are diseases such as sickle cell anemia that have been handled, and the whole biotech area is exploding because of CRISPR technology. And of course, AI, I don't have to tell you how that's changing the world we live in and what we do. And the notion of the melding of human and machine consciousness and the expectation of consciousness in machines is becoming more real day by day, year by year. And finally, I don't have to spend time on this. Political revolutions are changing the world we operate in. So what we have a combination of some incredibly complex directions that we can predict and some incredibly challenging disruptions beyond which we cannot predict the future. So you put all this together, what you have is a perfect storm combined with a tsunami of disruption. And I think those analogies make sense. Those concepts, those analogies make sense in terms of understanding the world that we'll be operating in. If I could go dig down into the specific, let's pick on climate change, for example. Given the fact that we're a Center for Sustainable Business, we've been looking at this for some time. And as I said, the military has identified this as a critical challenge. So let's accept that it is something that's affecting how we do business. And if you take a look at this, let me ask you to think about the characteristics of climate change. Is climate change clearly defined and understood? Let me answer that question for you. No. Okay. The debates we're having today are so obvious and so, how shall I say, violent almost in terms of the conversation that takes place. And then coming back here, are there multiple stakeholders with conflicting values and priorities who are affected by climate change? Yes. Are there many causes for climate change? That's really what's causing some of the lack of clarity in definition and the conflicting values, because depending on what you see as the causes, your perception of the nature of climate change alters. But the fact is these multiple causes are inextricably tangled, right? So whether you're talking about human intervention or whether you're talking about natural forces creating climate change or whatever, they are inextricably tangled in the Anthropocene area that we live in. Can you identify the correct or best solution to the problem? If you talk to Bill Gates, he has one solution. If you talk to Al Gore, he has a different solution. If you talk to Chris Gassman, who's the executive director of the Center for Sustainable Business, he'll give you a multiplicity of solutions that need to be applied simultaneously. So no, the answer is no. Does the understanding of what the problem has changed when reviewed in the context of alternative proposed solutions? Yes. Okay, if you're looking at climate change that's caused by industrial activity, clearly your problem definition is different than if you see some natural forces creating this, or maybe even our living habits or food habits creating the problem. I mean, those are far out, but relevant. I mean, perceptions of what the causes are. You tend to have if you looking at, for example, Bill Gates's attempt to reduce emissions from, say, cement production and concrete production, which is a significant issue, the nature of the problem changes that you have to address. So let's take a look again at this, but from the perspective of the classic problem-solving model. I have taken some liberties with this, but you will recognize this. The classic problem-solving model, which I was educated in my engineering days and my MBA days and my doctoral program days, was define the problem. I've modified it a little bit, but it is totally topologically identical to the generic problem-solving model that I'm sure you have built into your DNA by now. You define the criteria for evaluating alternatives, and you generate a bunch of alternatives to evaluate. You surface the root cause for the problem. You identify the solutions, and then solve the problem and move on. As I said, it's a variation on the classic problem-solving model, but it's to make a point here. And if you look at climate change, defining the problem, unlikely that you can do that with clarity and with agreement by all the stakeholders. There are multiple stakeholders. So again, what are the criteria for saying that the problem can be solved or is solved? Very difficult to arrive at that, at a common understanding. What is the root cause when there are multiple causes and they're inextricably tangled? Not clear at all. Do you know when you have the right solution? To use a mathematical phrase, there is no stopping rule. You don't know when you have the quote correct unquote solution, and you can't move on because, as I said in one of my articles, you cannot solve a wicked problem. You can only tame it, change the character of it, and address this new character on an ongoing basis. So if you look at this, disruptions are essentially what one might call wicked problems, which require an entirely different approach to addressing them as opposed to the classic problem. And some of the notions I picked up on in this, I guess is now so old we can call it a classic. 2008 is almost 17 years ago, but it's still the seminal piece on looking at the issue of wicked problems through in the context of strategic management. And essentially, what we identified there is that we have in management, in strategic management, been working on the bottom left-hand corner in the context of volatility and explicit separable causes. We think of how organizations are structured. You take the large strategy problem and partition it into operations, into marketing, into finance, into human resources, into R&D. So you are deconstructing the problem in order to make it manageable. But then the problem, all these solutions that you have in these various functional areas need to be integrated. And sometimes they look at the issues differently and the causes differently. So you have a real problem in terms of the traditional organization handling what we call wicked problems, where there's chaotic ambiguity as opposed to volatility around a mean, and where the causes are not really clear and where they're tangled and inextricably tangled. So we have not actually in our strategic management looked at the right top corner in terms of dealing with the realities that we are faced with today and increasingly so in the future. So what are the implications of this? The implications, to my mind, if I could summarize it in a classic 2x2, is that traditionally strategy, the way we have taught it, looks at adjacencies and for diversification and growth. For example, if you're John Deere, you look at the notion of taking your large excavating and agricultural machines and converting them into household level, home level kinds of tractors and so on, possibly. So you take these capabilities and apply them to new markets, for example, or new businesses. But at the same time, if you want to continue with your large agricultural machines, you have to develop capabilities and hone them in the context of robotics, in satellite imaging, and in high-tech communications, because all that is necessary for these machines to engage in precision farming, which is what's happening. So in order to stay in this agricultural machinery business, you have to develop new capabilities. So those are the traditional approaches. But because of the wickedness of the environment and the context changing fundamentally, you have to be able to make what we have traditionally called is the leap into the suicide corner, where you have to develop new businesses that require new capabilities, new competencies, new technologies. You have to do that in order to survive the extraordinarily different world that's emerging. And what we are talking about today, and what we are talking about at the Katz School of Business, the University of Pittsburgh School of Business, and the Center for Sustainable Business, is essentially how do we transform the suicide corner into an opportunity quadrant? How do we take this cliff dive that you have to make and essentially have it result in your identifying opportunities and profitability and new businesses and developing new capabilities? So how do we transform this into a depth leap, into a leap into opportunity? That's what our focus is on. And we have some notion of how to do that. So if you look at strategy as this notion of harmonizing the organization and the environment, I think what we have spent some time so far is talking about the VUCA nature of the environment, the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous nature of the environment, which is something which, as I said, especially with disruptions, is not something you can predict. You have, for example, as my colleague Chris Gassman would like to say, there are known unknowns which we have to handle in a different way than when we have the ability to predict. And there are also unknown unknowns which we need to be prepared to handle. And that's what we talk about in terms of designing a resilient organization. And in terms of looking at organizations in this context of extreme disruptions and wickedness and complexity, the classic notions of how to define an organization fail. The notion that economists have suggested that you use transaction cost economics to define the boundaries don't work anymore. I was talking to the CEO of Product in India, which is part of a conglomerate, which Javer Industries makes more ibuprofen. If you're having ibuprofen today and I'm causing you a headache, it's probably made by Javer Industries in India. But they have in their conglomerate, they also have a major IT operation. And talking to the president of Product, IT operation, I still remember him telling me, and I have it on tape. He said, I do not know where my organization ends and where my partner organizations begin, the way the teams work. The notion that an organization theorist might use about the structure defining the organization, that doesn't work anymore, because today, as the people at Honeywell told me, they see structure as a variable. It's not a given like in my MBA days, which I did in medieval times. You borrow the bureaucratic, hierarchical, pyramidal structure, which the Catholic Church and the military taught us was a very efficient model in the context of a stable future. The strategist notion of what your business is, what domain you're operating in, doesn't work anymore. What domain is IBM in? It was mainframes when I was an engineer. It became PCs when I was doing my MBA. And when I was doing some consulting, it transformed into a knowledge and consulting area. And if you look at it now, it's mainly a cloud company. So what is the business you're in? That doesn't help. And of course, the notion that we used to peddle that strategies should last for 5 to 10 years, that doesn't hold anymore. The ability for strategy to be flexible and dynamic is critically important these days. So the traditional notions of an organization don't work. And there, when you're looking for what is core to an organization, enduring and distinctive, in order to identify what your organization is, we end up with a notion which is basically the concept of identity. Identity defines what is core, enduring, and distinctive about you. And basically, that can apply to an organization or to a person. So if you look at this, I can develop this, but basically what's core to you or to an organization are your values. What is enduring about you are your aspirations, the kind of position. I mean, if you take a look at Elon Musk, his aspirations are enduring regardless of what he is doing. The notion, one can argue, of getting to Mars or ensuring the continuity of the human race, those aspirations endure. Your competencies are what make you distinctive. And this is true for people, and actually organizations don't have identities, people have identities. So you're essentially talking about their values, aspirations, competencies, which especially values and aspirations of the C-suite, competencies run throughout the organization. But this notion of identity is what you might want to think of as the touchstone of determining who we are as an organization and why we exist. These values, aspirations, and competencies lead to the notion of purpose, which, as all of us know today, is recognized as the fundamental strategic concept that we need to define in terms of defining who we are and why we are in existence. And that's the touchstone for strategy that makes sense, I think, in today's world. So in terms of aspirations and identity, this is very clear. The roots of it lie in the work done with the Hawthorne experiment in the 50s, the kind of work done by Dick Sahart and James March just across the hollow here in CMU, where they developed the behavioral theory of the firm in the 60s. Essentially, the notion is that one, that you need high-level aspirations. And Collins and Porras, when they talked about the vision, essentially, if you read their article, when they talk about a vision, it essentially is, and they almost explicitly say this, it is a big, hairy, audacious goal. So you have to have something that's difficult to achieve, but it's something that you're committed to, intensively committed to, aggressively committed to, which essentially, if you go back to all the theory, that's what promotes innovation. Okay, so there are a whole bunch of statements of purpose. Let me just put up a couple for you. The notion of sustainability. I know sustainability is a suspect word these days, but Dow Chemicals, prior to its alliance, its merger with DuPont, essentially the Midwestern headquarters of Dow 20 years ago identified sustainability as the long-term goal. But the argument there is very, very simple. Their competences of chemical engineering and chemistry enable them to address the issue of sustainability and in the process generate profitability. When I was talking to Pedro Suarez, the president of Latin America, Dow, which was the most profitable territory in Dow, he said basically this focus on sustainability and the translation of their chemistry and chemical engineering capabilities into businesses and products and services resulted in his organization being extraordinarily successful. You can say the same thing for Mahindra. They use a very simple notion of rice, which they apply to the tractors, they apply to the financial division. You know Mahindra, right? You'll probably notice Mahindra tractors. They sell more tractors than anybody else in the world. But they also sell Jeeps. They made the European Car of the Year a few years ago. They have a financial services arm, and everywhere they talk about elevating the consumer, especially in the financial area, addressing the bottom of the pyramid and elevating their economic well-being, and in the process making money. At our organization and entrepreneurship area, this is the statement of purpose. And you might want to look at the slide, but every word guides us. We are preparing in a variety of ways, not only in the classroom, but every way possible. Experiences, working with companies, projects, experiential learning. We are preparing leaders, not followers, to shape organizations. That is what we know about and what you're talking about today. Shaping organizations that embrace and impact. And the word humanity captures a lot of things, but essentially it's a kind of BHAG. It creates the kind of BHAG, the big, hairy, audacious goal, which generates creativity. So What we have been doing at the center and at the school, many of the faculty in the school are engaged on this. We have been looking at the notion of how does one design an organization that actually is capable of not only withstanding the tremors and earthquakes and uncertainties and volatility out there, but actually profit from them. And let me take you through a little bit of this. We have adopted two fundamental strategy axioms. Many of the axioms and the techniques don't work in today's world, like you do the five forces analysis that is very popular in strategy. It is somewhat difficult to apply in the context of unknown unknowns, as Chris Gassman would say, unknown unknowns. And essentially, what we have identified is what is it that we've been talking about in strategy from, I would say, from 1950 onwards. These words have been around, but essentially the word strategy has been around in the business context. This is one idea that I can expand on, have a 2-hour lecture on this, but this is fundamental. If you don't have a vision, if you don't have a purpose, you cannot make strategic decisions. So it is the fundamental necessity in order to generate alternatives and test them and select the best and implement them. And the notion of competencies is something that applies whether the future is known or unknown. So these are two fundamental notions that carry over from the traditional strategic thinking of decades, that's decades old. And if you put them together, the role of what the strategic leadership or the corporate headquarters should be is very clear. It's to articulate the vision, nurture and grow competencies. If you're talking about competencies, they reside in human beings. So the notion of managing human resources becomes key. So the other notion that we have borrowed, this is fundamental to this notion of a resilient organization, the strategic cause. The other notion we have borrowed is a very pragmatic understanding of what are the components in an organization, not thinking of operations, marketing, finance, human resources, the functional areas, but what are the design elements that we have in order to create, we need to focus on to create the organization. And a very popular compendium, composite of what the various elements are that create an organization. Again, from the point of view of designing an organization, are, of course, its strategy, its structure, and its systems. There's the notion of the skills or competencies, the staff or the human resources, and the culture or leadership style in the organization, and the fact that it's absolutely necessary to have a common set of values for an organization to function. So these 7 components are what we focus on in terms of saying, how do we design these components in order to promote resilience in an organization? And won't spend too much time on this, but just to give you a sense of all the elements that have gone into developing this model and the diagnostic instrument that enables you to assess your own organization's resilience. We have used a whole variety of models that are out there. I won't go through them, but you might recognize things such as Blue Ocean. We also use ESG, the sustainability notions and how they affect resilience. So what we did at the business school and at the center is, as we phrase it, we grabbed a bunch of faculty from operations, from strategy, from finance, from human resources and leadership, from our center itself, and put them in a room, sealed the room for a couple of weeks. And what they did, obviously, the managers of the center helped, our fellows, our MBA students or center associates helped. We essentially, this is the result of looking in detail at 130 companies. 15 years of research has been focused here. Doctoral dissertations, 27 articles on resilience were studied in detail, 23 sustainability frameworks. These were the faculty members who are the key members for the task force. This was the CSB team that was locked in the room with them. And essentially what they did was arrive at a whole inventory of ideas in relation to the 7 S's, drawing from the notion of feed forward, which is again something that was developed at the University of Pittsburgh School of Business. There are doctoral dissertations on it, and the ideas are so, in fact, the phrase CSR originated at Pitt. The phrase strategic management originated at Pitt. So we have a whole history of research to draw from. The notion of agility and ambidextrosity that every consulting company talks of. Of course, financial risk management, for example. And the interesting thing is sustainability has given us a whole bunch of ideas in terms of what is necessary for resilience. So we've taken all of those and said, okay, we want to create a resilient, ambidextrous, sustainable, and profitable organization. Every one of those words have rich meaning for us. And we took all the ideas that had been developed in the previous matrix and put them into 3 asteroid belts, if you want to talk about it like that way. There's the orbiting elements closest to the organization, which you call operational excellence. There's the notion of financial capacity, which it's a bit of an anomaly, but it is so critically important that you have the financial resources and capability to handle disruption, that how do we assess our capability is something that is clearly the second orbit that we have here. And the third orbit is the notion of feed forward, which is the notion again developed at the University of Pittsburgh, which again drives that, underpins the thinking about handling wicked problems. We talk about what is it, how do we derive our present strategy from an understanding of a future, which could be unknown or unknowable even. So those are the ideas which will enable us to essentially say, what do we do today in the context of this unknowable future? And there's some, it seems impossible. There's some powerful techniques that can be employed, which are listed here. And they are then clustered. We took all of these and said, okay, these ideas in feed forward, financial capacity, operational excellence, what are the commonalities here? What are the clusters we can create? And we arrived at 3 clusters, which are extraordinarily powerful. One is you have to have a transformative ambition that is inspirational. That's what a BHAG does. Okay, that's what an identity that's aspirational does. So you need an inspirational, transformative ambition, and we talk about how that's created and how that is manifested in an organization. The second thing is when you need new competencies, you can't do this entirely on your own. It becomes absolutely necessary to have a value network, an innovation ecosystem. We're calling it an innovative value network. It's something like the NATO when it was conceived. No single country could handle the threat of Russia. Consequently, you can say NATO emerged, or the European Union in terms of handling the economic challenge and the challenge of ensuring that the European continent did not continue its hundreds of years of history of armed conflict. The notion of how we create a network that enables us to generate those kinds of values or context. And the third thing, which sort of hit us in the face, was the notion of artificial intelligence and incorporating that in terms of ensuring resilience. So we took all these ideas in these 3 asteroid belts and clustered them into 3 critical notions, which we then elaborated on. I'm not going to go through all of this, but clearly notions of identity, the kind of structure, the systems that we might use, the planning systems and control systems to handle known unknowns and unknown unknowns. There's a whole lot of work there. So we pulled all that in. We essentially recognize the critical importance of a design thinking process where you start with an empathetic understanding of what the needs of the target audience or market or segment or clients or customers are. And the innovative value network, we brought in ideas of power from the international relations area, from the political area, which are very apropos to this notion of maintaining a value network, innovative value network. And we recognize that it's critically important these days to have public-private partnerships and partnerships with universities or sources of new knowledge. And we put all this together along with a hybrid intelligence ecosystem in terms of where is artificial intelligence having a critical impact these days. We identified those. And also in terms of human resources, the notion of management development, upskilling, cross-training, job rotation, all of these are fundamentally important and necessary ideas in order to ensure resilience. So we took all of these and created a diagnostic instrument. So this is available to you through this link. The pi.tt/roadlink, and you have access to it. And if you complete the questionnaire, you will receive from the center your resilience profile. I won't go through this because we're running short of time. But what you will get is for each of these three vectors, as we call them, you'll get your position in relation to the ideal for the I guess the 9 factors here, the 5 factors that relate to innovative value networks, and the 8 factors that relate to the use of the 5 factors that relate to the use of artificial intelligence. And we have essentially created this questionnaire for under these 3 vectors, which give you this kind of result. This is an actual result for an actual organization developed by people in the C-suite. And if you look at it, it tells a fascinating story. It takes this very complex area and focuses your attention. Okay? So if you look at this organization, you can see that there are major gaps in this arena here. They're pretty good on identifying what their core values are. They are engaging in entrepreneurial ventures, but they're not engaging in divergent thinking. It's where the adjacent entrepreneurial ventures is what they're focusing on. So essentially, if you're thinking about dealing with the VUCA world, there are 2 or 3 areas here which need focus. We need to focus on divergent thinking, which will be triggered by looking at underserved markets. And if you're going into these new markets, the notion of building experimental processes into your organization, recognizing experiments as what they are and not some ventures that have failed, for example. There's a whole cultural and practical process strengthening of the organization that is needed. You can see, if I could, they have not actually understood or applied the notions of smart power, where the notion of ideational power. If you take a look at it, there's hard and soft power, as the political scientists like Joseph Nye have talked about. There are 3 kinds of power that Gramsci, the Italian sociologist, has identified, and which people have used to create constructs such as smart power. If you look at what the US is doing right now, and has, I think, traditionally been focused on, is the exercise of material power, strength, military strength in particular. For us, it would be knowledge and competencies, for example. What is the notion of shared values and vision, to some extent, that has not been emphasized as much as could have been in terms of our exercise of power across the world. And if you look at it today, now, I think the shift is more towards the material side of things as opposed to the ideational and bargaining end of the exercise of power, which is, one can argue, perhaps not exploiting some of the opportunities we have for exercising influence across the world. So here, this, by the way, most of the organizations that we have looked at, there's a great weakness in terms of using AI tools. It's in its infancy. So that's something we are working on, for example, at many universities and obviously at the Katz School. Just last week, we had a major conference on the applications of AI in the supply chain. And we are applying, in that conference, we looked at actually the entire value chain, not just the procurement end of the chain. So in terms of this organization, for example, based on that diagnosis, there's a set of recommendations that have been developed, and actually explicit recommendations of what the organization might do. And in the last minute or so that we have reserved for the presentation, I'd like to say that we talk about these ideas. And what I have talked about is basically the kind of strategic thinking that is necessary in order to survive, not the traditional strategic thinking. There's ambidexterity here. There is dynamic modular structures here. There's the notion of identity that's here. There's a whole variety of ideas which are slightly different and not perhaps emphasized in the traditional models of strategy. So essentially what I've talked to you about is how to fish, but we will actually, in this seminar that we offer, which Max Clark is the program manager for, and his email is there if you need more information about this. We will talk in the seminar not only about how to fish, but actually help you catch fish. in terms of doing the diagnosis for your organization and getting a preliminary understanding of what are the things you might do, and also applying the notions of handling futures with known unknowns and unknown unknowns, possibility scenarios, robust actions, visioning your future, and defining your future business model, and identifying and creating and accessing the enablers to create a vision. And we also talk about how do you actually implement these changes, which Professor Minutolo is the expert on. So this is something you might want to keep in mind if you want to enlarge on this. It's offered in April and offered in May. And with that, let me just back up and say, okay, and remember this, there are two more webinars in the sequence. Oh boy, yeah, which will be offered on April 11th, the next one on April 11th at the same time, and another one 2 weeks later. So with that, let me stop talking and take questions if there are any.
Sure, John. And we'll give folks a moment to go ahead and either use the Q&A or the chat feature, whichever is going to be easier for folks. I'll go ahead and drop a link in there so that folks have it handy. I know trying to grab from the screen isn't the easiest. What do I, a leader in my company, if I'm trying to drive change, if I'm trying to be a change champion and lead a more successful, more sustainable business, what's one thing that, regardless of where I'm starting on that, what can I do differently starting Monday? What should I walk away with?
Let me tell you what the partner organizations with the CSB have done. Okay, some of them, few of them have actually asked us to present this understanding of the new realities to the C-suite and to larger elements of the organization, essentially to drive home the point which we all know at the back of our mind, but to bring to the front of our mind, what is the world that we are facing? Okay? It is, oh my goodness, I'm almost breathless when I think about it, because we look at universities, tomorrow is so uncertain for us today. Okay? If you look at the automobile industry, what's going to happen there? If you look at the the industries that are in manufacturing, what's going to happen with the tariffs? What's going to happen with the technologies we need? If you look at, for example, one of my favorite companies, which I've been looking at for a few years now, ASML, the Danish company, which makes the most advanced chip fabrication machines, $350 million a shot, working at the 7-nanometer level. That organization has 5,000 suppliers worldwide. And all those suppliers, especially the major ones, are all uniquely capable. They do things that nobody else can do. So when you have 5,000 suppliers of that nature, and the world is in turmoil, and relationships are in turmoil, and tariff barriers are emerging, and sanctions are being exercised across the world. If you look at ASML, I don't know how, without the concepts that we are talking about, the techniques we are talking about, they can manage the future. Okay? So essentially what we are talking about is, if you are in the C-suite, I think the first thing is to share this understanding with the other members in the C-suite, which is the world today is very different from what it was yesterday. I've been in the consulting game for 4 decades, and what I do now is so extraordinarily different. But I'm able to do that because I'm not caught up in operations, and the university gives me the luxury to sit back and think about it and talk to colleagues who are working in various areas, which most companies don't have time to do. But it is absolutely the time to do this now. And the other thing is, I know all of us at the Katz School have worked on it and are absolutely convinced that the diagnostic tool gives you the directions you need. If you recognize the nature of the future, then applying this diagnostic tool and then focusing your attentions in terms of the gaps that are identified, there's a clear pathway that we have developed at the University of Pittsburgh and the Center for Sustainable Business, which we need to apply, which we are applying at our university and our school, and which I think every organization we are working with, we are sharing this, and we're also building it into our MBA curriculum. So it's a new way of thinking, which doesn't give up on the previous, but adds this new understanding on top of it to create this ambidextrous organization that is capable of profiting from the uncertainties that we are facing.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Yeah, and that's one thing that we in the most recent training session that we held, a lot of the feedback came back very positive. The feedback came back very positively in general. In particular, things that they called out were experiences being able to think through these transformative scenarios, right? How do I actually transform the organization when the future is an unknown, right? And then in the scenarios where we know what the thing is, but we don't know which direction it's going to go. We don't know which path we're going to end up on. How do I make plans in that one? And being able to walk through each of those and being able to distinguish, okay, what kinds of things do I need to be lining up? Was helpful for folks. They don't have to do it with us, but again, if those are helpful to have an independent academic thought partner walk somebody through that, that's definitely things that a variety of companies have been able to, different leaders in large and small and mid-sized organizations have benefited from. To that note, John, I'll go ahead and drop in the chat a link to that training as well, just in case it helps for folks to have it handy. And again, the diagnostic one, that you don't have to engage us for that one. That is a publicly available research-backed tool that folks are able to utilize. You'll get your results immediately from the form itself, and then you'll get your more cleaned up, nice looking version with the spider charts that John had illustrated. Those will be coming, with just a couple of days. It's still a little manual process at the moment, but automating quickly. We got another just couple minutes in case anyone had any questions. I haven't seen any come in yet, but just to, out of abundance of caution, to tee up, like John mentioned, there are 2 other training sessions coming up here, live webinars for folks to engage in questions with folks digging in more specifically into the energy audit side of things. So if you are in the manufacturing space, helping contribute to building the things that help us create energy, help us utilize energy, move energy, there'll be another training or 2 on that coming up here in the next couple of weeks. We'll drop a link to that one here in the chat shortly. If I can ask James if he still has connection on that to drop the link for that in. But unless anyone else has any questions for us at this point, give it a nice professorial 30 seconds of awkward silence to let any in the audience chime in with any questions. Don't want to cut anybody off. Especially with time with one of our senior faculty members, chair professor in strategy. But if not, James, looking to you, you're able to drop that in the chat around the next one coming up. Otherwise, again, we can send over that as a link afterwards to folks to follow up for the next webinar series. And I think I might be able to pull it from, oh, there we go, from the next webinar as well. Here we go. There we go. Cool. That's for the next one in the series. Otherwise, again, folks, if no other questions at this point, I know it's Friday. It's been a long day for all of us, a long week for all of us. Happy to re-gift time back to folks. So do check out the assessments, the Resilient Organizational Architecture Diagnostic. It's pretty quick. Most companies, most leaders that we work with, when they do that, they're able to walk through it in about 15, 20 minutes. Hey, there we go. Question coming in just at the 11th hour. So you mentioned the uncertainties with higher education. What are some paths forward? So John, looking inward at our own industry, what are some paths forward that higher ed is looking at?
Okay, great question. Been thinking about this obviously for a long time, but let me take a step back here. Universities, and actually the first business schools to be part of major universities, I'm talking about the schools that were set up in Wharton, Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, and Michigan. The business schools are started in these major research universities. And of course, the fundamental notion of a university, which you can derive it from India, actually, the earliest universities, but we have adopted the German model. They are intended to advance the Enlightenment, to advance knowledge, advance science, and fundamentally to contribute to the social good and advance civilization. In terms of doing this, universities don't do it by themselves. There's a tripartite combination of three sectors come together. There's universities, there's government and business. And if you look at the major advances that have taken place, whether it is mRNA vaccines, whether it's nuclear energy, whether it is the internet, whether it's urban planning and development, I can go on and on. These are all a consequence of these three sectors interacting. So given the changing nature of the relationships, for example, between business and government and business and academia and government that are going on now, we really need to set up a new strategic platform for bringing these entities together. So in terms of the funding for universities, in terms of the focus of their research, in terms of translating this research into societal impact that advances the common good, universities have to explicitly, formally partner with the other two sectors, with the shell of the community around them. So as I see it, it's a structural question as much as a conceptual question. I think we know what we are in existence for. What we need to talk about is how do we enable this activity to continue and help this activity can have an impact, and we cannot do it alone anymore. We just cannot do it alone. The days when the NIH gave the University of Pittsburgh $900 million to do research, those are gone. Okay, it has to be investments that come from business or from government, but which are focused on a common understanding of what is it that we need to address, how do we going to address it, and what are our individual roles here. So the notion of a university being an island unto itself is not viable anymore. It never has been. It has to be explicitly put into the format of a multi-sector alliance, which consciously together a strategic digital platform, an AI-enabled platform, which enables these organizations to decide what to do. This has happened in major, I mean, if you look at NATO, in its glory days, NATO was doing that. It was bringing together doesn't, I don't know how many, 19, 20 members or more, but originally a fewer set, but it brought them together to a common purpose and do things together, which accomplished, I think, some fundamental goals which no single country could adopt. So the notion of a tri-sector alliance in the context of a community is what is explicitly doing that, and using all the AI tools and strategic platform tools to accomplish this is necessary for the university to survive.
So a great illustration, John, of the evolutions that organizations in each industry are going through, right? And being able to pay attention to where is the demand going and what are the supplies, the funding, the financing ways to get there. Is the demand actually shifting, or is it the supplies or the communication, how to distinguish signal from noise?
Absolutely. And Chris, if I could add to what the point you're making, that's one of the key elements we talk about in terms of resilience, the notion of building what we are calling P3U partnerships, public-private partnerships that also engage the universities. And one thing I want to emphasize is the depth and diversity of knowledge that the American Association of Universities, the R1 universities have, is unparalleled. It is an incredible resource which is of enormous value to the American economy, which needs to be explicitly and more effectively, I think, tapped into.
And one last bit that I'll throw in there for folks is if you're looking for further resources in creating resilient value, we do have a conversation among peers coming up next Thursday, all day. So the Sustainable Business Forum is all on the topic of navigating disruptions and creating resilient value. So timely, I'll go ahead and throw that as our last one there in the chat. James was kind enough to pull up the next webinar as well. That'll be after that on April 11th. And with that, unless anyone else has anything else for the good of the order, just again, thank you to our partners, Catalyst Connection, to Avijay, and to everyone else who helped pull the conversation together, particularly folks at WB Engineers. I appreciate you all for helping organize and for the content that you all are bringing in the next webinars. With that, thank you, everybody. Happy Friday.